Let's do it.
Hey Reed,
Hey man, can you hear me?
I can. How you doing?
Great. Doing good.
I love the paraphernalia behind you. A real collection going.
It's like my trophy wall.
Sorry, I'm a bit delayed.
Oh yeah, no problem, man. Yeah, let
So
me
what's up?
just not much. Not much. I guess before we get started too far, I just want you to know I've got a hard stop at like a little bit before 5. I've got to
Okay.
oops,
What time
bring
is it
my
for you now?
I'm sorry.
What time is it for you now?
3:15. So,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, it should be plenty of time. Just figured I'd
I'm
let you know.
yeah, I record everything by default. I don't know what you had in mind for the chat today because I figured it was just kind of like a chat, not a podcast, but if it ends up being interesting, then with if you're down for it, we can throw it up on the feed. So no
Yeah.
pressure.
Yeah. 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 Whatever, man. I'm just happy to be able to chat with somebody about this stuff. I mean, I think that you've probably talked to enough, let's say, plebs to know that it's just nice to be able to talk to people
Oh,
without having to
100%.
get like super deep dive on like side topics. Like, you know what I mean? So just to be
Absolutely.
able to have a conversation with somebody who can kind of keep up and who's thought about this stuff deeply in the past. So,
Yeah, and it's
like
also
I said before, I'm looking forward to it.
yeah, me too, man. It's great. One because there's not many people in our immediate lives that can hang on this sort of subject matter. And even if there's a level of interest, I mean, you really got to kind of get through a bunch of stuff before you can get down to
Exactly.
this level of
Exactly.
things and not be considered insane. So
Even at this level, I think we can all still be considered a little bit
well,
insane,
yeah,
at
but
least possibly.
at least we joke about it with each other.
That's right. That's right. That's
Like
right.
we're all in on the joke. I mean, whenever I'm hanging out with Eric or Gigi or all those guys, it's like, we get into the crazy territory and all you can do is laugh because
That's right. That's
it's
right.
either there's either some truth to it and it's hilarious because it's just too unbelievable, or there's no truth to it and it's hilarious because we're
You
all
thought
just
of it in
that
the first
crazy.
place.
Exactly. So,
Totally.
it is what it is. We'll all will be revealed in the fullness of time. I suspect and hope. So
Yeah.
we'll find
No,
out one way or the
100%.
other.
Yeah.
But I read your two articles, and as you say, that kind of stuff is right up my alley. I mean, I don't know if you know, but I've been attempting to write a book for over a year now, and the subject matter is very much, that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, was this your first? Was this your first writing effort? These two articles? I didn't dig much more into your work, if so.
I had a couple other ones. Maybe one that's somewhat related. Like, I talk in one of the articles a little bit about sort of like a path that I went down, traversed as part of like my rabbit hole. And I had a previous article where I was trying to draw connections between money and human energy, like what I think to be is really like a direct link. Like
Right.
it's energy, not in the abstract. Like it's not like oh hey, it's kind of like energy. No, it like literally is energy. And like when I was thinking about that, it was I I kept running through the scenario in my head. It's like, okay, is electricity energy? It's like, yes. Okay. If lightning strikes a rock, does it move it up to the top of the hill? Oh, well, no. Right. You need like a conversion device, right? You need to channel that electricity through a device that can actually convert it into like kinetic physical like energy. And I think money is the same way, right? If I place a stack of, if I place an open dime on top of a rock, like nothing's going to happen, right?
Hmm.
But if I use it if I give the money to a human, humans, oh, all right, you got a job for me, no problem. So to me, I think it literally is a form of energy, just the same way that physics would handle any other type of energy.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the first article that I wrote.
And sorry, I did actually read that because you sent it to me. I just went back through some of our Twitter
Oh
messages and
yeah, yeah,
I did read that one too. So I've read the three of them, I guess now.
yeah.
But no, I agree. It's funny. Oftentimes when, sailor is highly metaphorical And when people sometimes people take issue with his whole like Bitcoin is digital energy thing, and they say, like Bitcoin's not energy, like it's a useful metaphor. But what would you consider energy? Then would you consider oil energy? Which, like, to me, energy is it's like, as you say, it's highly dependent on what the machine is, what the substrate is, right? Like, does it motivate the machine to do non-random work in a sense? And like, as you say, oil's, kind of example, oil just on the ground doesn't do anything. You put it through an engine and hook that up to some sort of machine, and it's able to channel that energy and do work for you. And the same is true for humans and money. It's like, that's the thing that motivates us to work towards something in some capacity. And so, you could go down the rabbit hole quite a bit. It's like, what is energy fundamentally? But if you just look at it like as the motive and capacity to direct work, let's say, to a particular end, then yeah, money is energy for the substrate or machine that are human beings that accept it as such. Just as, most other forms of energy have something that channels them or parameterizes them in some way.
That's right. That's exactly what I was thinking too. It's like energy on its own doesn't do much of anything, right? You got to have something to channel it through to. It's got to have, a goal, an end in mind, right? Before, I mean, if we can't control it, it's fine that it's energy. But if we can't control it, is it really that useful to us? And I think money is one of the most useful forms of energy because it can be used for so many different things, right? It can be used for way more than electricity can be used because we can innovate all kinds of stuff, right? Beyond just simple electrical applications, right? We can do, we can innovate and we can think and we can do all kinds of problem solving things that a motor is not going to be able to do. Even a computer, even some of the AI things, I still think AI is going to be a tool for us, to control. So I think of it in a lot of those same ways.
Yeah, what makes you think, one of the perhaps one of the ways you might measure human progress is just, how we're able to increasingly refine the energies that we're using, or the ways in which we can channel energy, and we get more efficient at doing so, and the products of our channeling of that energy are more fruitful, broadly speaking. And if you look at it on that spectrum, perhaps money, and in particular like good money, is just a higher form, a higher refinement of that spectrum of what we would call energy, or being able to channel, refine energy towards ever more fruitful ends.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And so, maybe using that as like a little bit of a segue to the pieces that I just kind of dropped this week. One of the things I think that's so much different about Bitcoin is just the fact that it can't be corrupted, right? And I think kind of to start off, the kind of the article I really wanted to write was the one that's called A Theistic Perspective on Money in Bitcoin. And then as I was writing it, I kept thinking to myself, like, over and over again, like, how many people are going to find this like totally crazy? And so I sort of felt the need, like I was writing it probably for a Christian audience. But I also wanted to drop something in parallel with it that just says, like, hey, if you think a lot of the stuff that, I'm talking about here, I was trying not to really filter myself for being like too abstract, like outside of, let's say, a Christian belief system. But at the same time, I also wanted to kind of give something to other readers to be like, maybe take this how you will, but just so you know, I didn't come at this lightly. I actually it took me a long time to even be able to write a piece like this, like from the Christian perspective. But again, going back to what Bitcoin has that all existing forms of money haven't had is it's like supremely resistant to the corruption of evil. And I draw a lot of parallels there between, so what is it that actually makes all existing, not just money, but stores of value? right? All of our stores of value up until now have been physical, right? They're either based on human forms of cooperation, again, with physical humans, or it's physical assets that need to be protected in physical space. And anytime that you are dealing with the physical world, most of the time, because you want to protect those assets, you're going to want to channel the most physical security. And anytime you want to channel the most physical security, it almost always makes sense to centralize, right? So that way you can build up the greatest defenses around your, the asset that you've placed all your value into. And with Bitcoin, we just don't have that, right? There's no need to centralize it at all. Like you can custody, and each individual has the power to custody their own wealth, with just an absolute fraction of the cost. Like it's not completely free. Like there's some knowledge that you need, maybe a little bit of hardware that you need, but this stuff is all, in the grand scheme of things, like very accessible for the masses. And I think that when you do that, you take away the need for that centralization. And then I think just naturally with that, like each individual, I think can still become corrupted to what I talk about in the piece is really by, the forces of evil, that exist in our society that have existed throughout time. But there's nothing that they can do that's going to affect everybody else, right? There's no one that's necessarily in like a higher form of power that can access your wealth specifically. So I think that's kind of like the path that I was going for that particular piece.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. And you touch on a lot of things there, but to start with the last first, I mean, sure, the line between good and evil runs down through each of our hearts, as the saying goes. And to what extent is the incentive structure, the culture that we're embedded within, and all the signals that we're receiving and using to orient our behavior, to what extent are they enticing us more toward, one side of that line or the other? And as you say, I mean, when you create, by virtue of its physicality, as you say, you have to centralize. Centralization conveys an efficiency that you deem to be worthwhile. But as you say, like, the very architecture that allows us to derive that efficiency is also what sows the seeds of our own demise, because it just creates a larger and larger honeypot until someone somewhere, or many people, many places, say, this is too enticing not to corrupt myself for. This is too enticing not to try to, circumvent or contravene in some way. And, that's why we have the saying, and you highlight in your piece, absolute power corrupts absolutely, because at some point it's the ring of power, right? It's just, you throw it into the volcano. It's like, why shouldn't I keep it? It's so like, I could do so much with this. And, and a
Right.
lot of people convince themselves that it's for, altruistic reasons initially, or at least, that's how they create the sufficient dissonance to allow them to engage in what they probably know is an immoral or unethical act. But suffice it to say, I mean, that's how civilization has been structured. This tension between, okay, there's efficiency in centralization, but there's also the existential threat of centralization. And it just kind of waxes and wanes between that. And because the other thing that I talk about a lot is just the rules, parameters for behavior are obviously useful. I mean, that seems to have been borne out in history, right? But the problem is that how are those rules granted authority, or how are they established, or how are they upheld? And they're upheld by some authority that is capable of upholding them, right? Otherwise, they'd be contravened or discarded all the time. And so again, with, very similar issue to the centralization of power or wealth, like to have the rules you need to have an efficient and productive society, you definitionally need some power authority to establish and to uphold those rules. And again, you have that corrupting influence that at a sufficient size, scale, what have you, becomes corrupted to varying degrees, and then probably again, existentially, right? Like something can be corrupted to a certain degree for a certain period of time, but it seems to be that there's a threshold where, or maybe it's best to say, like, as the corruption increases, the effectiveness of what it's supposing to instantiate or propagate, i.e. the rules, just becomes less and less. And what you get is chaos and disequilibrium and entropy and all that kind of stuff. And so you know, as we often talk about in this space, and you highlight in the piece, I mean, if civilization up to this point was, you know, predicated on that kind of insurmountable dynamic between power and efficiency and rules and wealth and value, let's say, in terms of how we protect our stored value, i.e., our money, if that has been the base layer, and because of those qualities, we got the cultures, the institutions, everything. I mean, it's so fundamental to everything. Now, if we have a set of rules, one that doesn't require a enforcer, let's say, or a centralized enforcer, so that's, you know, we don't need to concern ourselves with the person who instantiates the rule, or the force that instantiates the rule to become corrupted. And then also we don't create a massive honeypot of value or wealth, because, as you say, it's not being centralized or concentrated. It's being the opposite, decentralized and distributed. So you don't create that honeypot that entices you to the corruption. Alleviating or rectifying or flipping those two things like right on their heads, I mean, it just has to mean that all the institutions that we've just taken for granted as like how humans operate or how humans coordinate their behavior at scale, they have to change, you know? And my point is like, we assume, I mean, I guess it's always the case, without identifying the proper causes, you might take something to be like, quote unquote, human nature. Like, well, that's just how humans are wired. And that's why we're always going to have these various institutions that we might both be critical of. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. If you know, and maybe we're wrong, but obviously as Bitcoiners, we try to really connect the dots on these things to try to understand the relevance of Bitcoin. And it seems to be the case that those two things are extremely fundamental. And when you totally reverse them or flip them on their head or whatever, you have to expect a different things to result, different things to be built on top of them. And I think what that means is like a total, you know, basically a total departure for the institutions and the systems of authority, control, wealth that have characterized civilization for the last 5,000 years to be completely changed, you know? And I guess my final point on that is the reason why I'm excited by that and not fearful, because someone might say like, yo, yeah, but aren't you fearful that like what's going to happen next? It's like, well, you have to look at the principles upon which or by which both, both circumstances are predicated. And I would, as we've been saying in the former, you have like this propensity to corruption. You have the incentive to violence. You have the incentive to dishonesty and lack of integrity and immorality and all of these things. Not to say it's always manifested, because there's been pockets of brightness and flourishing, and those are always ever present. But those principles were baked into the very architecture of that system, and they've bubbled up in various ways to varying degrees and intensities throughout history. This one that we're now talking about in Bitcoin has a totally different set of principles and values baked into it, and therefore it's creating a totally different set of incentives. And I would broadly describe those values and those incentives as being very positive, back to that line that runs down our hearts, enticing toward the good rather than enticing toward the evil. And, obviously that was part of the point you were making in your piece. And so if we thought civilization was at all cool or interesting up to this point, I mean, strap in, right? Because, if any of these things that we're now talking about are true, then presumably we're on the precipice of a massive, massive upgrade to everything that we rely on to pursue what's valuable to us, and to build lives, and to flourish, and to love, and to all those things. And that's why we're here, right?
It is exciting. It is exciting. I want to comment on one of the things you started down, but I do want to circle back to that, how I think where money, I think, and maybe more specifically Bitcoin, or at least in a more promising way, Bitcoin, but how I think money was always supposed to walk that line between good and evil. But let me go back for 1 minute too, because you talked a lot about, those systems of like the hierarchies, right? Where you have, maybe like a figure at the top of a hierarchy or a structure. And, one of the things like in the second piece, that we haven't really talked about yet, one of the things I think that I never really, I was raised Catholic, but one of the things I think, especially as I got older and really once I started to figure out, you know, all the negative things that can come with those centralized systems of authority and control is, I just didn't like the way that their system is set up, where it's a honeypot, right? It's a honeypot for controlling people's religious beliefs is like kind of an enormous amount of human power. And so to intentionally put, human people at the top of that structure, to me, one thing to say, first of all, at least with respect to Christianity, which is really the only religion that I have any, real opinions on because I've actually taken the time to look, but it's really kind of miraculous that it's still here in more or less its same form. None of our government systems have lasted anywhere near that long. And so, there must be something to say for the people who are in those places to at least be able to withstand some of that. I do still think that there's, at least for my taste, I, you know, I still think that the church would be more powerful if they decentralized some of that rather than put it into those centralized pockets of authority and control. But at the same time, like I said, it is kind of a testament to the church that they've been able to withstand these things for so long. And if you think about how Christianity started with, one guy basically, to the fact that it's proliferated throughout the entire, earth is, pretty, pretty impressive. So, but yeah, going back, one of the things I sort of opened my first piece there with talking about this line between good and evil, right? And I think especially the Old Testament and the Bible talks a lot about that. And I couldn't help but start kind of with the Garden of Eden, just because it's that prime example. And it's an example I think most people, whether you're, Christian or not, or whatever, you've probably heard at least somewhat about the story of Adam and Eve and getting kicked out of the garden and the temptation and all this stuff. And I just think, to me, it's basically just like the perfect illustration of the fact that, we're never not going to be corrupted. It's just way too easy to corrupt. Like, evil can corrupt people just so easily. All it took, the serpent or whatever comes up and it's like, hey, well, why don't you just do that thing? It's like, oh, okay. No problem. Sounds like a good idea, I guess.
A lot of that
And
over the last 2 years.
yeah, it's just like so easy. It's just so easy. And I think that that's really the problem, right? Is we're so easily corrupted that, like, why would you, like, putting humans in control of anything, to me, putting humans in control of other humans' lives is just, it's just a recipe for disaster. And so what I think, and being able to like draw conclusions about Bitcoin or about money in like the context of that story of like Genesis and the Garden of Eden, okay, so let's say there was no money in the garden, right? It was just like the perfect utopian type society. We wouldn't need money, right? It would just be everyone's doing everything. What I say is like kind of backstopped in love, let's say, right? Let's say you're on a barter system or whatever. If things don't add up right, you're like, close enough. Like, we're all good. Like, you'll get me back later. I know you will, because we're like operating in the system of love. And like, maybe that has to do with Dunbar's number. Maybe that has to do with a lot of things I think that Bitcoiners have talked about. But at some point, that all fell apart, right? And so what I'm saying is that that's sort of like the expulsion from the garden. And at least if I'm trying to draw like the parallel to the biblical stories. And so I think that in order for us to survive, really, and not just be completely decimated by war and violence and slavery, I think that money was kind of invented to say, like, hey, like, yeah, our memories aren't perfect and maybe we can't completely trust each other anymore. But hey, we can use this medium of exchange, this thing in the middle, and we can sort of walk that line, right? Now we don't necessarily need to like love each other, like, unconditionally in order to like do business, but we also don't have to rely on like, coming in with a sword and being like, well, I want you to like plow my field or I'm going to like chop your head off. So, it allowed us kind of that system to, what I say in the piece is to walk that line between good and evil.
Yeah, I I agree. There's a few points there, but you saying that just now makes me think of I think it was with Gigi, like we had just a random, call that I think turned into a podcast that was actually published, but it was a couple of years ago, I think. And anyways, we were exploring that idea of how the properties of Bitcoin allow you to establish what are in effect, similar or equal to like a relationship of love, but with people that you don't know, that you've never met, et cetera. Because, of what Bitcoin represents, it means you're going to respect them to that degree. You can't cheat or lie to them. You're going to act as though they have an equal, like, intrinsic or divine value to them in exchanging in the way that you do. Like, it's almost like that Bitcoin and the network that it represents, and the qualities that we know that it has, as you say, like it allows you to extend the relationship of love, or at least an aspect of it, because we could get into the weeds about what a loving relationship might be, but like that kind of mutual respect and intrinsic value, and inability or lack of desire to corrupt, lie, contravene any of those rules. And so I think that's a very good point, and I agree with it. I think, back to the origins of money, again, another rabbit hole that we could probably spend a lot of time on, and this is kind of like dissecting or looking at the metaphor. I feel like even in, let's say we all live like communally and there's only 250 of us or whatever, and we loved each other and God through each other, and the whole genuine real love thing. Do you think the function of money still allow a greater specificity of dividing up our resources and what is effectively our sacrifices? Because we're saying like, well, I'll devote some of my time to this and some of my time to that, and I'll do this for you and that for you. And so, like, one point you make where it's different is like the memory, the ledger, right? That's kind of, even if you had a relationship of love with 8 billion people, it's like your brain just can't manage all that. But I think also why it may end up being more fruitful, at least in terms of extracting more potential from the world, let's say, is because it allows you to cut up or divide up the world better than, just what a loving relationship might allow for. Now, maybe I'm taking the metaphor too seriously, but I just wanted to get your take on that.
All right. Well, if we haven't gotten a little bit woo woo for your taste already, buckle up here. So and so one of the things I talk about, and this is really more like in the second piece that I titled An Open Letter to Bitcoiners, but we don't have to go into right now why I titled it that way. But I was like very much, it was really interesting for me how on my Bitcoin rabbit hole, I ended up pursuing God. Like, it just wasn't like something I thought would just happen naturally, right?
No,
And
most people
that's like a
didn't,
whole
but
nother
it's
conversation.
becoming very common.
I
Yeah.
know. I know. So that's like a whole other conversation. But the thing that I was stuck on is I started to think about, well, what do I want with my future? Right? What's like the best thing for me? Like, and then it's like, well, what even is the best? I want what? Peace and happiness and joy and like all these things. Well, how am I going to get those things? And it's just like, it's a hard thing to put your finger on, especially when you're trying to think like out into the future. And so, interestingly, when I found myself going down kind of the rabbit hole of God and religion and things like that, I started to think that if you actually look at, let's say, Jesus's teachings, right, he is like very much not focused on earth, right? I mean, certainly, I think he knew that the end of his life was coming. So maybe that's like an easy reason to say that he like wasn't focused on earthly things. But I think, looking at it, just taking the Gospels, the New Testament, like, we can just think about it literally for a minute, right? Because ultimately I wasn't taking it literally when I was first reading it. I very much took it as like metaphorical. And I think, I tried to walk through some of the steps that led me to start actually thinking, this stuff, maybe I should be thinking of it more literally. And I think if you look at it literally, he's just not focused. I don't think that earthly things, even necessarily happiness here on earth, I don't necessarily think that that's the end all be all. Like extracting, like I think you said, extracting like potential or extracting, goodness out of humans on earth.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I think that's more of a means to an end. And I think the message in Christianity is you're only here for a short time, right? But really the focus should be on eternity, which is like a much larger fraction, infinitely longer than your time here on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that when you start, if you start thinking about it that way, it totally changes like your orientation, right? So like I am now starting to think, and that's part of the reason why I wrote these too, right? Is like I'm starting to think that maybe my orientation should be more focused on God, right? And more focused on, Christianity and like spreading that message, because at the end of the day, that's going to kind of be what the thing is that saves my soul, like after I die. So again, like I know it's like definitely a bit out there, but like that's how I would respond, right? Is that I don't necessarily think, going back like guys directly to your question, I don't think it was necessarily needed to be the focus. Like we didn't need to like extract more, potential beneficial, energy production. I think as the goal maybe was just to live in harmony with God, right? And to have that loving connection and to sort of bask in the light. Not necessarily to like, build spaceships and go to Mars and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
So I guess maybe that's how I would respond.
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, I think about and have talked about this issue a lot, and another way of framing it is like, well, if we, what is progress? How you define progress is going to determine much of your life and what you strive for and all that kind of stuff. And as you say, in the modern culture, we tend to define it broadly as innovation, like more spaceships and wormholes and better internet. And the more traditional amongst us, it seems these days, might be like, well, and healthy family and happiness and peace and health and these sorts of things. And those are probably far more eternal than the former. But as you say, like that's what progress means to a lot of people. And what you're saying reminds me of reminds me of asceticism, right? Because a lot of Christians, Christian mystics, and ascetics, and all sorts of other faiths, the basic premise is, I love God so much. God is so fulfilling. God is so sustaining that it's not that I have to actively deny the rest of the world. Like I have to not eat the pizza. I have to not want the Lambo, anything like that. If it's genuine, it actually means I have no desire for them whatsoever, because my desire and love and sustenance from God is so much greater. And in that I that is logical to me. And I've read enough of the accounts of them and considered it enough to like, it really, I can see it. It makes sense. And so the question, I guess, is partly like, what does that mean? So to your point, like I when I say extract potential from reality or from the world, I think that's part of the reason why money did develop. Your basic, refrain, or your response is like, is that even what we're supposed to be doing? Maybe now another one you could say, well, if some of that didn't happen, right? Let's take hunter-gatherer ancestors. Let's say if we didn't start engaging our world, if we didn't start expanding our capacity for communication and representation and expression, to what degree did that type of innovation permit us to have a better, higher fidelity relationship with God, and therefore be able to be so sustained and filled up with it and access its value, let's say, and so there's, and I don't know the answer to that, but I guess all I'm trying to say is like, I get that point, but I guess to put it back over to you as someone who's been going through this type of transformation, it's like, how much are you willing to, and again, like, maybe this is the wrong way of putting it. I'll say it just for context, but I was going to say, how much are you willing to renounce? But I think the better way of putting it is, I'll put it another way, because I read that, I can't remember the particular Christian who said it, but it's like, it was something to the effect of, I love God so much. In relative terms, I hate everything else in the world. Not to bring up the notion of hate, but just to paint that picture of how the love of God can be so sustaining and fulfilling that everything else basically loses its relevance. And I guess the question to you is like, how much are you willing to let go of the relevance of everything else of the earthly pleasures, let's say, because we are so much a product of that. And again, like for the sake of this conversation, I'm not I'm not saying yet where I might fall on that, but we are so much products of a culture that emphasizes material complexity and abundance and innovation. Talking about earlier how we were saying, things being flipped on their head, like Bitcoin flipping the architecture of civilization on its head. This is another one, right? Like a fundamental orientation where God or Christ is the highest value and everything is in service of that, or material potential is the highest value and everything is in service of that. And they're really kind of fundamentally at odds. So how do you contend with the emerging, it sounds like the former is kind of what's welling up inside of you, but here we are talking over Zoom on computers, like very much a product of that. I guess the question is like, what's keeping you from being an ascetic?
So I think the way I've been thinking about it is, let's just say technological progress, okay, I think was inevitable. I think it was going to happen. If we want to take it back to, how I started this, which is like, let's say, the introduction of evil or sin into the world, let's say. I mean, that immediately, have you ever heard that like so many of our modern technologies and things that we're using for good were developed by the military, right? Like a lot of these things that let us leverage power to like the maximum efficiency, they were tools of war. Like that's how they started. And I think that there's a lot of that. And I think that what we're doing here, let's say in Bitcoin, and I think the internet as a whole, and let's hope that maybe Nostr can help try to follow in some of these footsteps of the early internet. I think we're using those tools to fight back. I think this is our way to fight back against all the energy that has been leveraged. That's our opposition, is I guess where I'm going with that. And so I think the fact that you and I can be sitting here on a Zoom call, like talking about like religion and God, I think this is our way of being able to fight back against all the energy that, let's say, our enemies are using against us, right? To like propagate voices of violence and voices of suppression. Like they're using technology to for their agenda. And I think we have every right to be able to use it for our agenda. So, I mean, I suppose you asked me like a pretty direct question, which is like, how far am I specifically willing to go? I mean, I think I have been, as I'm sort of revealing, as more of this has been revealed to me, or I've, uncovered this for myself, certainly a lot more. I'm willing to, let's say, sacrifice, like I'm a lot more than I would have earlier. I think it's probably a progression. I don't think I'm gonna like ascend to sainthood and like disavow like all earthly possessions necessarily. But it almost kind of makes me think too. I think the opening sentence, or at least in the opening paragraph, it's like money has been painted in this like super negative light, right? Like all through like probably many religious texts, but certainly in the New Testament and probably in the Old Testament too. I'm not necessarily like an expert here, but kind of everybody has it in their head that like money is like the root of all evil. And I think that for the lot of, if we rewind our conversation and talk about centralization of power and authority and control and what that means for the propagation of violence, yeah, money was like a pretty kind of evil endeavor, right? Even if you were going to quote unquote use it for good. I actually refer back to, I had to add it in when Saylor just recently, I think with you, brought up the idea of dying with your Bitcoin wealth, right? And what that actually means in terms of, let's say it's energy, right? Where does that energy go? And the answer is now he specifically is not in a position to be choosing winners and losers, right? Because even if you build up all this wealth and you're like, oh, I'm going to be like the best person ever and give it to this group and give it to that group, uh, you don't actually even know what they're going to do with it,
Mm.
right? Like all of a sudden you become the arbiter. You're issuing all this energy, right, to these other entities that need to decide what to do with it. And a lot of those are probably not going to be used if you're like this great person. They're not going to be used the same way that you really would have ideally liked them to be used. So I think that with Bitcoin, probably for the first time ever, we have the opportunity to make a different decision, right? We have the opportunity to just decide to let our wealth, quote unquote, die with us. And what that actually does is it doesn't remove the energy, right? And I think that you know where I'm going with this, which is where Sailor went with it, which is you're actually giving it back to everyone. So now we're talking about a situation where even though you're building up, let's say, quote unquote, even though Bitcoin isn't material, but like let's just say acquiring, storing, building up wealth is somehow supposed to be frowned upon, you at least have the option now of doing something what I think would be more like in a decentralized way, right? You can give out your wealth in a completely decentralized way to all holders of Bitcoin in this particular case. So maybe that was like maybe I didn't give you like a direct like specific answer to your original question, but you know I certainly have been thinking about it, and I think that there is a certain amount of sacrifice. And one of the things that I look forward to, you know, right now to operate in our current world, right? Like most of us need fiat jobs. Certainly, I still have my fiat job, and like would I like to like give that all up and like maybe go do something else? Like yeah, maybe. You know, I'd have to think about it more, but I think it'd be great to have that flexibility. And so I think that being able to build up wealth in our modern age, I think also is it's a tool to fight back, right? If I have the financial freedom to, let's say, go out and do God's will, you know, that's great because I'm operating in a world that's like completely full of chaos and evil. Like I'm not like in a position to just become like a homeless person, right? And like roam around like preaching the good news. Like that probably wouldn't be like a very like long-lived endeavor in our current modern age, maybe. But if I'm able to build up wealth in what I think to be like the most ethical form of money ever, the most ethical store of value ever, you know, maybe that's not really that such of a bad thing, you know. And hopefully I hope that it gives me the freedom one day to be able to do, you know, what I think is maybe optimal for my existence here on Earth. And maybe I'm not ready to decide that like right now today, but I hope to in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing. And to your point about what Sailor mentioned, I mean, you adopt Bitcoin and you kind of inherently adopt a certain set of values. If for no other reason, it's because to acquire Bitcoin, you must exchange, which means you must make a kind of sacrifice, right? I need to sacrifice my time to go to work to get the money to buy the Bitcoin. And so you're sacrificing for Bitcoin. And what is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is fundamentally its values. Like, you know, it is truth. It is, you know, honesty. It is freedom. It is all those things that we often talk about. And so you're in a sense sacrificing to those things. And if, you know, when you die with your coins, let's say, then as you and Sailor have said, you're making basically a pro rata distribution to all the people who share those values, who've also adopted them. And, you know, as you say, what's better than that? Because you leave it to, you know, your son and then your grandson. And within a couple of generations, as I think Sailor said, you know, it gets left to your delinquent, like, you know, grandnephew who's going to blow it on, you know, hookers and coke or something like that, you know, and then all that energy that you, through your hard work, through how you oriented yourself, through the ethics that you lived by, gets completely almost, it gets co-opted, you know, it gets co-opted, and that power that has, you know, that you brought in because of the way you acted in the world, because of the value that you created, and because of the value that you were in terms of how you oriented your actions. Again, what your ethical or moral principles might have been, the value that, you know, you attracted to yourself based on that just gets co-opted in a flash, because you've left that mechanism to somebody else. And so, And that's another hard pill. I want to go back to your answer to my question, but that's another hard pill to swallow, because you say like, oh man, but am I really not going to leave my wealth to my kids? I mean, I love them. I want them to have the best, I want them to have the best life. But it's like, yeah, but what's the better move? Like, grander scheme,
Define best. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
what's the right move here? And it's hard to argue against bequeathing your wealth to all the other people that, or at least has the highest probability of having lived by the same moral, laws or ethical rules that you have lived by, and had the same approach to value and living and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's hard not to make that case. I think you might squirm a bit and say, okay, well, I'm going to die with some of it and leave enough to my kids so that, they're good. But, then another thing comes up. It's like, is that a good thing? Is it a good thing for people to be left money? Of course, we'd all be like, oh, fuck, well, I'll take a few $1,000,000, like if my uncle or my parents died. But again, how much does it corrupt you? How much does it cause you not to go through the necessary moral, character, individual, physical refinement to become someone that's actually worthy of value in the world, worthy of the fruits of your labor? Like, is it not kind of that unearned wisdom thing where you like, yeah, you get all this wealth, and now you can satisfy, a lot of your preferences. You can satisfy a lot of your carnal pleasures, let's say. But is that a good thing? Is that like, does that set you up? If I actually love you, is that what I want for you? Or
Mhm.
do I want you do I want to instill in you the mindset, the knowledge, the wisdom, the moral education that is sufficient for you to go out and then take that and forge yourself into something of value, and something that's capable of receiving value from your community or from, the broader world? And like, as I'm saying it right now, because I haven't given much consideration to this issue, I think that is the better approach. And we all have examples in our life where, we probably know friends of friends or people we know that were like the trust fund baby types, and they're probably not the type of people that we would most want to emulate. Like, some of them are, some of them, got the trust fund and they got a really good, family education or grounding or what have you. But a lot of them, it seems to corrupt them, unsurprisingly. And so maybe it's best to just to funnel the value that you've accrued in your life into the place where it's going to be most judiciously used, i.e. into the Bitcoin network. And then and maybe that places a greater emphasis on how you educate and inculcate and steward and develop your children. Because you're like, look, I ain't leaving you with money, but I better leave you with something that's going to allow you to go out into the world and make of it what you want to make of it, rather than just, dumping a few $1,000,000 on you and saying you don't have to worry about stuff. It's
Yeah.
here I am now,
Totally.
but I think that's probably going to be my approach, because that seems most logical to me. Um, and then before I hand it back over to you, just
Mhm.
because you said like you don't think it's about extracting that potential, and then we talked. You said like, I think it's more about serving God or loving God, and having that be the most fulfilling thing in your life. And I guess my question was just like, what does that mean? Like, where is the line drawn between engaging the world and, having just the the love of God fill you up at, so that you don't need anything else? And I don't know if you know much about the Cathars. They were a sect of Christianity in southern France. Can't remember precisely the year. I want to say 700s or something like that. But in any case, the basic premise was that the material world was damned, was basically a manifestation of the devil, and all that they needed and wanted and valued was that kind of one-to-one relationship with the spirit of God. And that was so sufficient that, the enticements that the physical world represent were representative of the devil for that reason, because it drew you away from that relationship with God as far as they were concerned. Now, because of that, they didn't procreate as much as other groups, because if you think the physical world is damned, then you're probably not going to propagate, do your best to expand into it or to propagate your lineage into it. And another one, they were considered heretics, and there was something called the Albigensian Crusade. I think uh, that was the Pope's name, and they were heretics for whatever reason, and there was a crusade against them, and they basically were all killed in like a genocide of some kind. And so that's a little bit of that history, but I bring it up only to mention that, like, people have been chewing on this issue for a long time. Like, how do you strike the balance between the material and the ethereal, or the the satisfaction one might derive from a true relationship with God and the material concerns of the world? And how do and the line between the material concerns, right? So just what's sufficient versus all the other forms of complexity that the physical world has latent in it, and how much should you pursue progress in that domain versus progress and being satisfied in the purely spiritual realm, let's say. And that's a tough one. But I think you mentioned this in your piece as well, that not only because Bitcoin seems to be predicated on these values too, that causes us to chew on them a lot, but another aspect of Bitcoin is the capacity it has for liberating people from the current socioeconomic structure, right? So it can liberate you from inflation, from the banking system, from the 9 to 5, based on its increasing purchasing power over time. And that alone is presumably, and it seems to be the case thus far, allowing people the freedom to consider these things, right? Whereas before, like, you're in that fiat system. There's nothing you can do about it. You might as well just respond to the incentives that it's throwing at you, and you go. Or, and that's the corruption part, right? Because you either do that and you become corrupted by those incentives, because just by virtue of responding to them, or you reject it, but then you're rejecting the world, and then the world that you're rejecting doesn't treat you well, right? It basically comes, you become like against it in some way, or it becomes against you. And so neither of those, outcomes or approaches are desirable. But then something emerges that is, morally and ethically aligned with what you think is good and true. And it has the capacity to reform that system, like as we were discussing when we started. And it's providing you the freedom to better grapple and better consider all of these things, and what is value and what is truth, and how one is supposed to orient their lives in relation to those things. And I think we, as a group, like as early Bitcoiners, and this discussion in particular, is an example of that. Like we could just be an aberration. Like, me and you might be the weirdos in the basement or like in the corner at the party, and there's never going to be a big groundswell of people thinking like this. And I fully accept that potential outcome. But it seems to be the case that more and more people are kind of thinking like this, and they're trying to, all these insights are just constantly emerging within them, and they're trying to find the proper place for them, and they're trying to determine how much they should, influence how they orient their life and their behavior and their career and what they strive for and their aspirations. Like, it's all so intimately tied up. And these are the big questions that you inevitably knock on the door of when you try to untangle that knot. And so yeah, I mean, that's why I asked you directly, kind of like, well, where does that lead? When you say, like, it's not about the potential of the world, but it's about serving and loving God. It's like, what's the maximal extent of that perspective? And perhaps it is asceticism, and then we have to wonder or speculate. Because I agree with you, like, Bitcoin allows us to, quote unquote, fight back against that fiat system, and absolutely, of course. But it's like, where do we fall on that spectrum of being so fulfilled by something grander versus wanting to play in the terrestrial game, let's say? And I guess we all have to answer that for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I've a few things I think, I guess, to respond, that came to my mind. Definitely first of all, I forget the name that you said it was, the group of French.
The Cathars.
Yeah, there you go. I'm not familiar with them, so just based on your description, I'll just talk for myself here, because I think perhaps my beliefs don't necessarily line up with any particular Christian, like, religion necessarily. I was trying to draw from, like, a lot of different things, and really what I was trying to do was find what makes sense for me. And then, rather than, like, go ask a priest or go ask, some other, like, religious I'm just trying to like let it sit in my heart and like figure out, do I think that this thing makes sense? And like a term that I use a lot is mental framework. And I have been trying from the beginning to develop some kind of a mental framework that actually explains some of this stuff to one person, and that person is me. Like,
Hmm.
how do I actually make sense out of this? So again, a long way of saying like, let me speak for myself and like hopefully not like step on the toes of any particular, religious belief system. But
Oh,
I,
sure.
I,
I mean,
yeah,
you're gonna step on somebody's because there's so many different interpretations. So I mean, absolutely.
yeah,
Just we'll take
yeah,
what you say is not intended to offend anyone. It's just the way you're
of
seeing things
course.
currently. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have absolutely no problem with the world. To me, I think, God created the world. I don't think he created it to be like a den of sin and evil. I think he created it to be beautiful. I think he created it as a place that we can be truly happy here. And I think that he didn't want us to be alone. I think he wanted us to be able to, be in groups together and hang out and have a good time. I have no problem. I don't think that people's lives should be like miserable in their utmost like servitude towards God or something like that. I think that we're here to, be happy. And I know we kind of talked about that in the beginning, and it's like, how do you actually even define that as a goal? But I think that's something that each individual needs to wrestle with. And really, when I say wrestle, I think the way that, again, going back to my mental framework, the framework that I have for it is how strong is my connection with God? And it definitely ebbs and flows, at least again, speaking for myself personally. And so I think when it's ebbing, I find myself more like getting back to something I've struggled with in my past, which is like depression and anxiety and things like that. And then when I find myself on those upswings, it's just like, you know, I find myself making decisions and choosing actions that are leading to my happiness, whether they're necessarily like, it's not like, oh, God's like whispering in my ear necessarily, but just having that connection to God in general, like having that be on the upswing, spending time pursuing these truths that we're talking about. I think for me personally, has made a huge difference. And so part of what came to mind when you were describing that is I definitely do not think that it's just like, the earth be damned and like all this stuff should just be forgotten about and wasted. I think that that would be a disgrace just towards everything that God took the time to make. And I think that, being able to connect with other people, being able to have children and like raise them with these like this as like their foundation, that's to me, I think that that's the point, right? The point is to like spread this message to as many people as possible, to get as many people, if we're talking about this world and then the next world, how many people in this world can we bring into God's kingdom, into the kingdom of heaven? And so there's unique, I think in order to find like true peace and happiness, I think the goal for each person is going to be unique, right? It's going to be different for each person. Each person has their own set of skills. It's not that everyone needs to become a wandering preacher in the wilderness. Maybe, hey, some people, maybe that's what they were born to do. And like that was their like earthly goal. John the Baptist, like his goal in life was to become like a wandering guy through the wilderness wearing like all kinds of weird skins and stuff. Like that was his path, but it was not everybody's path. And so I don't think that that's necessarily like what everyone needs to do. And I don't think that everyone's going to be able to like 100% perfectly live up to that, whatever that ideal thing is that maybe God had in mind for each individual person. But the closer that we can get to that, I think is going to bring a lot of things. And I think one of those things that it brings along the way is that sense of peace, is that sense of happiness. So that's at least kind of the first thing that came to mind for me. I think there was another point I wanted to make, but one
Well,
one of the things. Oh, go ahead.
okay.
No, go ahead.
Just going to respond to what you said there. Well, a couple things actually, but one again, it's not that I'm trying to harp on this point, but the true ascetic, right? And this is counter to the Catharian example, I believe. But even though they're renouncing the world, it's not because they think it's evil or damned or anything. Like the true ascetic lives the ascetic life because they couldn't imagine being more fulfilled than they are because of their relationship with God, you know? So I get that. And I've read enough account, like I see the logic in how genuine that can be. Um, and so and I take your point as well. Like, you know, everyone to borrow a term from the Hindu faith, let's say, like perhaps everyone has their kind of dharma, right? Not everyone is supposed to be the wandering ascetic. Not everyone is, you know, different people do different things, and perhaps there's a reason for that. And so the motivations for them doing those things are going to be different. And as we keep saying, like what these conversations are about is like trying to determine, well, what should my motivation be? Like, what should I be striving most for? And that's a challenging question. And again, to dip into the Hindu realm, um, the notion of nirvana, like a lot of people kind of equate it to enlightenment, and you know, you've ascended to some plane and all suffering has ended. But I think it's more, and there's several interpretations to this effect, that it's rather just like an extreme acceptance over every moment and every action because of a grander understanding of how it all fits together, let's say. But this is kind of why, like, you know, what do you do the next day after you've reached enlightenment? Well, you chop wood and you carry water, right? And it's not because you're disciplining yourself again or you're rejecting the world, but it's because those actions are so much imbued with that wisdom, that reverence, that connection with the divine, that they, you know, they are valid for that reason. And it's valid that you engage in them. Now, to me, it still begs the question, like, which wood and what water and where, and, you know, like there's what action should you be most striving for? And you know, I'll turn it over to you if you have any insight on that. But, you know, because we're dealing in these realms of extreme value. And before, one more thing before I hand it over, I mean, you mentioned inspiration. And I think to go back to your comment earlier about, you know, there must be something to the church and the faith if it's been able to sustain itself for 2000 years. And I completely agree. And, you know, a modern secular viewpoint is like, well, it's just been, you know, corrupt bullshit all the way up and down. And that's why it propagates, because it's a mechanism of control. I'm sure there's elements of that, but you, as you say, you don't get something propagating like that. You don't, every small town, you know, since the beginning has needed, basically up until 100 years ago, has needed a kind of church, right? Like you go to a town anywhere in the US, Canada, Europe, has 300 people in it. It's going to be a little church there, right? And I think that speaks to the importance that people placed on what that represented, and how the cohesion that it fostered, and the moral framework, the moral compass that it represented, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I don't think, you know, that wasn't a necessary directive. Like, I think people were genuinely inspired by the value of what that represented of them to make it a necessity. Equally, if you and I were to start a city somewhere in El Salvador or in Latin America or wherever, like maybe we'd put a church, but we'd also say, no, the money has to be Bitcoin. And I look behind you on your shelf and I see all these examples of inspiration, you know, and I think decentralization only works if you have inspiration, right? Because centralization is top down, like this is what we're going to do, everyone, you know, execute on our order. But for something to work in a decentralized capacity, for it to have any sort of extended life, it has to be an indwelling inspiration. People have to see the value in it and have to be self-motivated to contribute to it, learn about it, engage with it, all that kind of stuff. And you know, so I think inspiration is a huge part of all this. I was just checking a note, and you mentioned that inspiration is like, you know, I think you said saved in your heart, or held in your heart. And again, I think that's true. And what these discussions are like trying to maybe enhance the fidelity of the communication between mind and heart, right? Like, how do you use the two to orient yourself properly in the world? And I think now that more and more people are starting to see, one, a different future for themselves, right? A more hopeful future for the world, with more opportunity, with less violence, with less division, and an increased future capacity to make choices for themselves and not be incentivized, coerced, forced down certain paths for reasons of economic deprivation, let's say. This question of what should I be most fundamentally oriented by or towards, and how, what actions should I engage in as a result? And that's definitely one that burns in my mind, because well, possibly because there's no one answer to it, and that's probably part of the answer. But I can't help but ask, most people I speak to. So over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I was saying before. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily think that I've got a perfect answer. Um, I I think I may have said this already, but at least to me, the way that I'm thinking about it, like I think certainly, I think that highest ideal is going to be different for each person. And I think the only way that you can start figuring out like which direction should you be pointing your life, let's say, if we're talking about um, a perfect direction for each individual person. I actually had in another article, or maybe I never published it. There was like this great depiction of past, present, and future, right? And it's just like every decision that you need to make in your life, like all your decisions in the past have led you down a particular path to get you where you are into the present. But then as you look out into the future, there's all these other paths open to you, right? Like how, which, how do you start getting, you're not going to be able to pick like an exact perfection in terms of which decisions do you need to make like every minute of every single day as you're deciding, what to do, whenever you're doing it. However, I think that you can start, if you start looking out at the landscape, like of potential futures that you could find yourself in, how do you like get at least pointed in the right direction? And I think that's what mostly I've been trying to focus on. And I think for me, the only way that you get that, I think that we can't know. Like we just as humans, like it's just impossible. It's asking people to know the future, if you ask me. And I don't think that that's, even though we're always constantly trying to see out even little bits into the future, you're never going to be able to see. There's too much, there's too much chaos in the universe to be able to see out any meaningful distance. We can't even predict the weather like tomorrow or this afternoon even. So, it's impossible really to look very far out into the future. But it's not impossible for God. At least that's again, going back to mental framework, that's kind of the way that I've been thinking about it. And so again, the more that you can tap into his knowledge for you specifically, again, I don't think it's going to be perfect. But I think that you can start getting bits and pieces of information or knowledge or wisdom or whatever you want to call it that say, this really seems like the right direction. And there's like that faith, right? Where maybe it's like counterintuitive. Like maybe you really don't think, like you're like, well, if I was thinking about this like a rational human, like maybe this doesn't seem like a good idea, but I don't know, something in my heart says this is what I should do. So I'm just going to go and do it. To me, that's kind of like that faith, right? That's having faith in God that he's actually steering you kind of in the right direction. And I think one of the other things I thought maybe now is the right time to bring it up. I have a quote in there from the New Testament, right? Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves cannot break in and steal. But the real key here is, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so again, like that, in the piece, I'm kind of tying that back to Bitcoin, because again, Bitcoin is not in a place that's going to rot and decay. It's in a place that can't be stolen. And I think that when you start putting your heart into places like that, rather than your heart into, let's say, like fiat or into like physical forms of wealth that you need to like protect with, like, let's say, guns and weapons and violence. um, I think there your heart will be also, right? If you're putting all your heart and soul into something that you literally need, like a military, to protect, well, there your heart will be. And I think when you start storing it in something like Bitcoin, I think just in the same way, like that's sort of, I guess, my answer to the question of why are so many Bitcoiners like finding themselves here, is like there your heart will be. And it's like once you start stripping away like all this evil that is in the world, and you're like not, you're choosing not to tie yourself to that directly. I think just by removing that in general, now you're like opening yourself up to be more receptive to a lot of this messaging that I think is coming for each one of us. It's just being able to tune in and hear it and listen. So again, I don't have all the answers. I do think that it's a kind of a different answer for everybody. And I think you probably need to do the work. Like each person probably needs to put in the work to try to figure out what that is. And unfortunately nowadays, you know, it's a tall task because the world we live in is just a crazy place. And you're surrounded, it's like temptation just blaring at you from like all angles. And so being able to try to get through that, you know, that's why I really do. I'll go back to what I said before, but I think this is technology that's allowing us to fight back. That's what I think. It's
Absolutely.
it's it's giving us the power, it's giving us the energy to actually find our way through this mess. And it's hard not to. I know a lot of people have made this connection before, but you know, it really does seem just like a shield, right? It's a shield against the world, you know, and it's allowing us to just like have the freedom to do what we want and have our store of value where we've tied up again. You know, and I've thought about this a lot, that, you know, your wealth, it's stored human energy. It's you. Like when you're giving, you know, if you want to give all of your energy to BlackRock, it's you. Like you're giving them you. Like, you know, like do you really trust them like with you? Like you personally?
Mm.
And when you start thinking about your wealth that way, it really, I think, makes it easier to make that case why when people are like violating store value assets, when they're stealing your money through inflation, it's an attack on humanity. Like it's not just like an attack on like your quote unquote like purchasing power and things like that are like a nuisance or something. It's like literally a violation of human life.
Mm.
And so that's, you know, part of my, and I know I've been going for a little while here, but part of my, one of the things that made it real for me, like when I say made it real, you know, it was one of the problems I had, I think, with religion in general, is just it all seemed metaphorical, right? It all just seemed kind of like, oh, hey, like I kind of get it. Like this is like a good way to live, and it's like helps you be happy. Like that sounds great. Uh, but when I started to take it more like literally, it, although I have had like what I think to be like spiritual encounters, like very positive experiences, I think one of the things that really lifted the veil for me was like, you know, the existence of evil in the world. You know, I really think that they, you know, quote unquote, they, like whoever that is, not necessarily any particular like human, let's say, but, you know, the forces of evil that exist in the world, I think that they, especially recently, have been overplaying their hand. Like I think a lot of people, and even not maybe even just Bitcoiners, are waking up to the fact that these things are out there
Mm.
and it's real. Like they're working against us. Like their goal is like to extract human energy, right? To extract high quality human life hours, right? Whether that's by population reduction or whether it's by enslavement, you know, whether that be by taxation or any other form, you know, getting people to do work for them without being repaid. I mean, these are all like, that's what I would say. I mean, that's just evil. Like, it's just, I gotten to the point where just, I can't help but just call it how I see it. It's just like people bring stuff up and my mind goes like, oh yeah, like, oh, that's Satan. Like, oh, okay. Like, I don't know what to tell you. They're like, what? Like,
Yeah.
but
Well, you know, I think I've characterized this dynamic, and I agree that more people are starting to maybe see the world in those terms. And maybe this is why the devil has been characterized often as a kind of trickster, because And obviously a lot of people, in again, modern secular society are, the word spirit is not very, they might say that they're spiritual, but it's a type of terminology that kind of turns them off. But if you take spirit, or at least one interpretation or one way of looking at it, as the primary motivating force. We talked earlier about the line that runs down between our hearts, right? And like both of, there's a motive valence to either of those. And I think that those forces are they draw out certain behaviors, but they're also given more life through certain perspectives. And I think you peel back the onion, like, well, why is BlackRock doing this? And why is the WEF doing this? And why are these governments doing this? I mean, most of the time, I don't think these people are like intentionally evil. They don't go to bed and take off their horns and like, cackle before they fall asleep. I feel like they've been tricked into a perspective that allows the spirit of quote unquote evil to act through them. And they haven't done what you said a few minutes ago, is taken it upon yourself to really, whether you want to call it introspection or your own hero's journey, or take it upon yourself to understand yourself, understand your relation to the divine, or however you want to characterize what's greater and grander than you, and that it encompasses everything. Like those people, I would say, probably haven't done that. And as a result, they become a far more receptive vessel for that force that is broadly characterized as evil, that force of enticement, that force of corruption, that force of dishonesty, that force of disintegration, that force of destruction, and conversely, as you say, if you do the opposite, if you do investigate yourself like that, and if you do, have a shield in the form of Bitcoin that not only is a tool, but is one that you can use to even refine yourself through, through contemplation, through understanding, through attempting to investigate its nature, let's say, then I think that allows you, or that makes it much harder for you to become a vessel for evil, because we're all imperfect and we all probably act in minorly evil ways quite often, let's say, maybe not in the egregiously, but evil construed as even just, ignorance where there could be knowledge, let's say. But I think that's the basically the responsibility that everyone has, is to do their utmost not to be a vehicle for the spirit of evil, let's say, and to even attempt to be a vessel for the spirit of good. And like as you say, you look out on the world today, and it's, I think more and more people are it's pretty easy for them to peel back the layers of the onion pretty quickly and be able to identify like what's going on at the base layer, let's say, there. And I get that, to bring this conversation full circle, I feel like that's part of the reason why so many people are returning to religion, because it's becoming more evident that the world is being divided on these like fundamental forces. And then it begs the question, like, well, what are those fundamental forces? And has anyone ever tried to understand or communicate these fundamental forces? And the answer is like, yeah, a lot of people for all of human history have been trying to do that. It's been basically the central focus up until 100 years ago. And of course, then we go and we investigate and we read that stuff and we try to grapple with it ourselves. But I agree. And to your point about framework, we're all, everything is susceptible to our own interpretation, and so everything gets put through our own filter in that sense. And so again, ignorance is ever present and eternal within us, but you can improve the quality of your framework, improve the quality of the filter that you put over the world. And again, to your point, and I think this says a lot about the validity of I want to be careful how broadly I characterize this, but a God-based perspective, maybe that's the best, one way of putting it, is that when you use that as a filter, and that very much animates how you see, or influences how you see the world and how the world is kind of animated for you, and what the results or the products of that type of filter are. And I would, generally speaking, if it's genuine, that's a huge caveat, because you said, like there's a lot of people that by virtue of where they are born, where they grow up, they get their their Jesus card or their Muhammad card or their Buddha card, and they just presume like, oh, I'm one of those people now. It's like, no, no,
Mm-hmm.
no, you're not until you've done the work to understand like why you
That's
are.
right.
But
Mm.
to the extent that it's genuine, that filter seems to in reference to the conversation we've been having, also kind of open up a path in life. It helps you identify the good, or at least things that are closer to the good, and therefore what you might move towards or what you might be might gravitate to. And if you don't have that, then I think you're far more susceptible to ignorance. You're far more susceptible to that so-called spirit of evil using you to express itself in the world. And again, one of our, perhaps it's a useful way to characterize our modern predicament, is that people, I think maybe I'll put it this way. I don't think people recognize that it's unavoidable, right? You're going to have a perspective on the world. You're going to have a worldview. You're going to have a framework. You're going to, like, there's going to be a way in which you see the world. A question that I often ask people is, what makes you think your perspective is valid? Because everyone's
Mm.
walking around the world thinking like, oh, I've pieced it together good enough and it's good enough for my job and put a roof over my head. But like, what makes you think it's valid, or it's as valid as it could be, at least, or if it's grounded, like what degree of truth do you think it's grounded in? And that kind of a bigger question. And part of the point in that question is that you're going to use something to interpret the world, or at least as an aid to interpret the world. You're going to have a type. God is inevitable in a sense. If God is the thing of greatest value that allows us to deconstruct and move through the world. And if you intentionally or unintentionally throw that away, discard one because you don't actually think it's valid, and presume like, well, I'm just not going to have one and I'm going to see the world objectively, that I don't think that's a possibility. I think you're just being tricked into adopting one that you're not as aware of. And again, one way of characterizing the modern world might be that, sure, like the death of God happened, a lot of people threw that away and just presume that now they're going to be objective. But instead, what's happened is they've just adopted another God. And religious people might characterize as saying adopting basically the devil. Now maybe we would, what might be the manifestations of that, or what are the authority structures that people may have put in that place? I mean, I don't think it's too much of a stretch today to suggest that it's kind of like the state, because what else has kind of not a commensurate authority and power, but like what's the next most powerful thing? And maybe we construe, yeah, well, let's put it this way. If we're trying to figure out the best way to navigate the world broadly and all the different incentives that exist there and all the different signals it's sending to us and all the different chaos, as you alluded to, you look for the thing that's kind of has the most influence on it, the most control on it. Now, a religious person would say, well, that's God. And so you should live in accord with God's properties and principles, perhaps. But someone who's not religious may take the next rung down on the ladder and say, well, the state, of course, is the thing that has the most influence and power in the world. And so, again, de facto, very few people, if any, would admit this, but I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that a lot of those people have inserted the state where God once was, because it seems as though it's as influential, as powerful, as consequential. And I think that is another one of those ways in which people have been tricked or have tricked themselves. And that trickery is what's allowing what we, when we observe it to be, manifestations of or spirit of evil, what allows them to become those vessels, because they're not as aware as they could be about what is generating or influencing their perspective, and therefore what is acting as a filter for the various behaviors that they may engage in. And so when you bring up someone like, BlackRock literally siphoning the human hours away from people, and you might even say it's like our hours contain, our behavior contains not just our time, but everything that we are, right? Soul, spirit, all that kind of stuff. So is it kind of like a soul sucking thing? Again, that's too religious for the secular crowd, but along the lines of the way we've been discussing it, perhaps it's not too much of a stretch. But do they, again, I don't think they're they're aware of what they're doing, nor engaging in that intentionally. I think they're just responding to incentives and not being disciplined with themselves, responsible enough with themselves, nor have subjected their perspective or their worldview, maybe submitted or humbled it to the appropriate power above themselves. And in many cases, I think they've inserted themselves as the highest power, and I think that's why in the world today, we see so much ego-driven, self-aggrandizing behavior, because the individual, as much as I think the individual should be free, I don't necessarily think that the primary or most valid or beneficial perspective for an individual to have is simply their own aggrandizement. It's simply the expansion of their ego, let's say. I think, and most religious people, I think, would probably agree with this, but the individual is supposed to like subordinate themselves or submit themselves to that higher power that people call God, and that is and have free will of themselves in between, like interpersonally or intersubjectively on earth. But that is perhaps a more healthy and a more truthful or fruitful, let's say, perspective to have, and one that seems to be the case is better at staving off that, accidental, let's say, accidentally becoming a vessel for what we've been calling the spirit of evil and all of its different manifestations in the world. And so, kind of bringing it full circle to your point about it, using it as a framework and trying to figure out, it's a journey or a process to refine that framework, but just kind of recognizing that you're going to use one, which one is the best one to have. I think that's a very rational and logical approach to take to this, especially, again, when confronted with the absolute clownish chaos of the world that we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to call it out. You know what I mean? Like, and I think Bitcoiners are like among the best at just calling, we call it how we see it. I understand that this is like what you like or you think is great, but it's terrible. So we're just not going to hold back. I don't know what to tell you. And I'm going to have to go in like a few minutes, but one of the things that you were talking about, it made me think of one of the books that I read, and we don't need to get into what it was, but they talked about this study that was done by a neurologist, right? And they were studying, they got some nuns to pray while they were in like this brain scan thing. And they were showing that like certain areas of the brain, like, oh, this area of your brain like lights up like when you're praying. And when they showed the results to like the neurologist community, they're like, oh, that's the area of the brain that like makes them think they're talking to God. But then when they show it to the nuns, they're like, oh, that's the area of the brain that I use to talk to God, right? It's like, when you start seeing like objective evidence in the real world, like you can use it like one way or the other. You know what I mean? Like if you're going to choose to write it off as coincidence, or if you're going to choose to write it off as some physical phenomena that we haven't been able to explain yet because we don't have enough data or something like that, then that's what you're going to do. And then, but if you're in the religious camp already, like you're going to use that to say, look, I'm showing you like evidence, like that, this thing I've been telling you about like actually exists. And so, I don't know. That's one of the things that I think of a lot of times when I'm trying to put myself maybe in the position of someone who has closed that door, right? They've closed themselves off to this whole, like a lot of the big, like whatever woo-woo things that we've been talking about, as, all that stuff is, that's just crazy talk. Like I live in the real world. I don't know where you guys are. But this whole conversation, I feel like has been, really helpful for me. And I appreciate that you read the pieces, and I'm glad you liked at least pieces of them. So, yeah, I'm really happy that we were able to take some time out and have this conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it myself. And I think when you first messaged me a while back, I think you sent me like a couple screenshots of what you were working on.
Oh yeah, it was probably a lot different back then.
Well, yeah, but I loved where you were going with it. So I think I responded something like, keep going or finish it up and send it over when it's done. And
Yeah.
so, I guess my final point is, I mean, the whole reason why I'm currently writing a book is because you can feel that whether there's any truth to anything we've said here today, and obviously we're kind of spitballing and playing off each other, and like they're big ideas and highly relevant conversations to have, I think. And I think a lot of us are feeling that. And so I think it's incumbent, as we mentioned at the end here, upon everyone to, actually genuinely grapple with it, because there's a recognition that it's a very consequential in your life. The answers to these things, or how you determine you're going to implement them in your life, let's say. And to your example, like, I think, well, everyone, this is obvious, but writing is a great way to disentangle that stuff, and make it more clear in your mind. And then, of course, is a great way to scale your feedback on it. You can put those things out into the world and get people to comment on you, and then engage in that collaborative process of really trying to continue to triangulate on what might be capital T truth, or even, incrementally greater truths as we go. And, I'm appreciative to everyone who engages, my own passion for having these sorts of conversations. And so I'm very happy you hit me up, and really glad you made the time for the discussion today.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I'll just say, for me, like specifically, like writing is not like it doesn't like come like super easily to me. Like I would say
Oh, me
these two
neither, man.
pieces, I worked on these for at least a year, like at least. And a lot of it was because I kept hitting a wall and being like, I need to dig deeper. And then
Mm-hmm.
I'd go and like read a couple of books and like read, some articles and listen to some podcasts. And it's like, okay. And then I'd get to like another brick wall and be like, this doesn't make
Tell,
enough sense for
tell me
me to
about it,
want to
man.
put it. It doesn't make enough sense for me to want to put it out there to the rest of the world until I've at least had enough time to like put some meat on it and like integrate it into that mental framework. Because if I haven't done that for myself, then like conversations like this are just never going to go anywhere, because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's just too surfacey. Like I needed to understand like a little bit more, at least have like a stronger conviction in what it was that I was actually writing. Like if there are still open questions in my mind, then it's just a signal to me that I need to keep going. So
Yeah. Well, I feel you, man. In trying to write a book, I mean, I encounter that all the time. You think you've peeled back the right a sufficient number of layers of the onion, and then you find another layer, and that means so much before and after has to be changed, and
oh yeah, big
it's
time.
kind of a maddening process, but it seems worthwhile. So I guess that's why we continue to engage in it.
It certainly lets what I think about it, and why I decided it was worthwhile to take the time is it's great that I have like figured these things out for me. But I think any way that I can help contribute to someone else's pathway, right? If they pick up one or two little pieces that are like, oh yeah, I was missing that, then maybe they'll be able to use that and piece it in. So, you know, hopefully, I don't have like a huge following or anything, but it's still worthwhile for me, I think. And if nothing else, it really does, like you say, it really helps. It forces you to make sure that everything that you're thinking actually fits together, right?
Yeah,
When you have to write it out and it has to like be a thing that makes sense as a
to-
standalone package.
totally.
So
Because
there's value in that as well.
we walk around with this like loose impression that we understand our philosophy or our system, our frameworks of various kinds. Like we just like, oh yeah, it's in there and it's coherent. But then when you try to write it down, you're like, oh shit,
I
it's,
know,
it's not that coherent. And then it's like,
right?
oh well, am I living out that incoherence? I don't want to be doing that. I want to be living out coherence. And so, again, for that reason alone, it's probably worthwhile, despite how painful it sometimes feels. But
Yeah,
Reed, thanks again for the time, man. I'll let you go, and
yeah,
look forward to catching up sometime in the future.
yeah, 100%. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
All right, brother. Take care.
All right, bye.